Good afternoon. This is the Autistica Research Festival panel on ethical considerations and working with the community. My name is Sue Fletcher-Watson. I'm a developmental psychologist. I'm a professor based at the University of Edinburgh, and I'm really delighted to have been invited to chair this panel full of wonderful experts in participatory autism research. Before I ask the panel to introduce themselves, just a few little reminders. We're using the webinar function in Zoom, so that means that unless you're one of the panel, you can't be seen or heard. So don't worry if you want to make yourself a cup of tea while we're talking, that's fine. You will be able to use the chat function to send a message to the Autistica staff. That might be useful if you have any technical problems or questions. But if you want to ask a question to the panel, and we would love for you to do so, then please click on the Q&A button to post your question. I'd like to remind people about the code of conduct for the Autistica Research Festival. Please be respectful of the time and energy that people are putting into being here, and be aware of the wide range of experiences and backgrounds in this audience and on the panel. Remember that you won't always agree with everything you hear. Sometimes our panel may not always agree with each other, and that's okay. We're encouraging open discussion and questions. But if the Autistica team do observe anything that looks like harassment or bullying, or acting in a way that stops other people from being able to participate, you will be removed from the session and from future events. Also, just a reminder that you can join the conversation on Twitter, and we'd encourage you to use the hashtag AutisticaFestival for your tweets. We're going to keep ourselves muted when it's not our turn to speak, and I'm going to ask our panel to put up their little yellow Zoom hand if they're particularly keen to respond to one of the questions. And I will put up my little yellow Zoom hand if I feel like we need to draw to a close in order to move on to the next thing. I'll be trying to keep an eye on the time and make sure everyone gets a chance to speak on the topics that they want to talk about. So the way the session will work is we're going to introduce ourselves. People are going to say a little bit about how they got into participatory work, or how you might be able to get into participatory work. Then we've got some prepared questions that will take us up to about 3:30, maybe a bit after that, and then we'll open up to questions that you've posted in the Q&A. So please do post your questions as we're going, and we will come to them in the second half of the panel. So here we go. So I'm going to ask Sarah if you would introduce yourself first, please, Sarah.
I am Sarah. I'm currently the Research and Policy Officer at Autistica, and my experience is as an involved person and an involver of people. And from September, I'll be doing a PhD in how to do involvement in a way that's inclusive of disabled people and their needs.
Brilliant, thank you, Sarah. And now, Georgia, if you'd like to introduce yourself.
Hi everyone, I'm so delighted to be here with this amazing panel. My name is Georgia Aikenhead. I am a researcher at the Alan Turing Institute, working with the wonderful Kirsty Whitaker as well as Autistica on a citizen science project. And what we're looking at is sensory processing differences in autism and how this affects how autistic people navigate different environments using a very participatory, open citizen science approach. So yeah, really happy to be here.
Perfect, thanks, Georgia. Susanna, do you want to introduce yourself?
Yes, so I'm Susanna Fantoni. I was diagnosed with epilepsy when I was 3 and then autism when I was 15, and I completed my master's degree in 2018. I've been on a sort of prolonged hiatus since then due to ill health and then COVID, but I've been working with Georgia for I think just over 6 months now at the Turing with the hope of kickstarting microRNA research.
Amazing.
Doing really brilliant work, just to add to that.
Fantastic. And now, last but not least, Eloise.
Hi, I'm Eloise Stark. I'm really happy to be here today with this great panel. And I'm currently a postdoctoral researcher at Oxford, and also a part-time assistant psychologist working in a CAMS neurodevelopmental conditions pathway. and I'm really here representing the Autistic Research Collective, a group of people who created a co-produced guide to adapting psychological therapies for autistic adults. So I'm hoping to draw on those experiences today.
Brilliant, thank you all. So yeah, let's talk about how you got started in this kind of research, or how other people might be able to. Perhaps I'll go back to Sarah again first.
I got started by just talking to a researcher who I really liked their research, and I wanted to see if there was any way that I could get involved in helping to shape it. And they said yes. And so we worked on a couple of projects together, and then I just kind of started talking to more researchers and fell completely head over heels in love with involvement and co-production as a way of working.
Perfect, thank you. Yeah, that kind of snowball effect, I think it's very familiar, isn't it? You get carried away with it once you started. Georgia, why don't you tell us about how you got into this?
Yes, I was working for the civil service, and I was on secondment to Autistica. So I began working for Autistica and then moved over to the Turing. And basically, while I was there for my secondment, I realized that this was such an incredible project to be involved in. So the real focus was on community priorities and looking at autistic people's preferences for not just what research should be in the content of it, but how that research was run. And I found that I was in an environment where I could be around people with completely different perspectives on the world and life experiences and ways of thinking. And it was this extraordinary period of growth and excitement where I felt very value aligned and like I was really growing from others' different perspectives of the world. So I was just really eager to join, and I stayed beyond my secondment to continue working on the project. So that is how I'm here.
Amazing, you got bitten by the bug. Susanna, how about you?
Well, yeah, as I said, I completed my master's in 2018, and it was actually in digital media. And my dissertation looked at sort of the benefits of social media for young adults with autism. So sort of a month after I graduated, I still wasn't sure if I wanted to stick with media or go down the research route. And I just happened to be doing research, work experience in this big media company when I was invited along to a focus group at the Alan Turing Institute. And I remember leaving it that day and phoning up my dad and being like, this is what I'm meant to do. This is where I'm meant to be. And probably about 18 months later, I was invited to another focus group, at the end of which Georgia said, if anybody's interested, let me know. And I just sort of yelled at the screen, yes, please. I want to do more. And yeah, that's how I found myself into this project and my story so far, really.
Amazing, perfect. How about you, Eloise?
So I got my diagnosis of autism partway through my PhD, and through sort of a network of contacts was invited to take part in this co-production project. And before then I hadn't really met many other autistic people. I had sort of my own perspective, but I guess working with other amazing autistic people and non-autistic people, I really learnt to love the way we see the world through different perspectives, sort of a real appreciation for sort of intersectional autistic identities. And yeah, I think my advice to anyone who's watching this, maybe thinking about getting involved in participatory approaches or research, would be to approach researchers who you think you like the work of, you like how they think, and say, I love your work, or I think this could be better. And I'm pretty sure that any researcher would love any autistic insights into their world, because they're super valuable.
Yeah, I think that's great advice. I remember giving a talk once about co-production, and someone in the audience, a researcher, a non-autistic researcher, sort of said, but how can I find autistic people, and I had to really bite my tongue not to ask everyone who was autistic in the audience just to stand up, because I knew there were like 20 or 30 people in the room. I thought, but it can be really hard to know where to start, you know, and I think you're right, researchers love to be contacted and to know that someone's got that drive and that passion, because you can worry about putting a burden on people, you know, when you're asking them if they'd like to be a partner in something, especially if it's at the stage where you're writing a grant, you don't know, you know, you don't know how far it'll go. Anyway, this is not about me talking. I just really agree with you all, and you're all wonderful. So our first question, what is the most important consideration for you when undertaking participatory projects? I'm going to ask Georgia first.
That's such a brilliant question, and obviously a really hard one to answer. To narrow down to one thing, especially since everything is so interrelated. But Eloise, what you were saying about intersectional autistic identities really struck a chord with me. Like, I'm quite influenced by Kimberly Crenshaw, where it originally comes from like a very specific context, of course, in the context of American justice system and Black women in America. But I do think in this context as well, I remember coming across in your book you wrote with Francisca Joffe Sue about the autistic constellation, and thinking about identity in a completely different way to just these kind of pre-imposed categories where you can predetermine somebody's relationship to the world and themselves by something that you have imagined without consulting them. So I think it comes with a degree of humility to kind of think, well, what am I imposing? What are my assumptions and prejudices, particularly as a non-autistic researcher? I think humility is really important, and especially particularly given the history of autism research, which has often kind of flowed from those prejudices. So being able to be self-aware and curious and open-minded, and I think from there comes a real joy, because you can, if you carry that attitude with you, there is just so much to learn and growth to be had from others' perspectives. So I guess that's two, but yeah, intersectional awareness and joy.
Yeah, I love that. Joy is amazing. Welcome back, Susanna. We're still just on the first question, so you haven't missed your turn. So yeah, Eloise, what's the most important consideration for you when you're undertaking a participatory project?
Yeah, Georgia, I really love your response. I think it was really important. And I guess mine's a little different. So I would say that my most important thing when doing research in sort of co-production kind of participatory area is to enable people to feel and be authentic. I think authenticity is something which you can, if you're looking for research answers, you need to be able to be authentic in explaining how it impacts you, how you might think it could go, in order to really get the right answers. And in our co-production project with the Autistic Research Collective, we really worked hard on enabling each other to feel that authenticity and to just say, look, I'm gonna be non-verbal for a bit, or I need to play with some fiddle toys, or I need some headphones on and just my own time. And that was okay. And for people to really feel that comfortable to do that. And it took a lot of work, actually. It didn't come easily to get that, but once we got a sense of it, it was so important and so helpful.
Sounds wonderful, Eloise, to have got to that point of comfort with each other. I think that's such a great goal for any kind of collective research team. Now let's think about lessons learned from participatory work. So I'll come to Sarah first. What key lesson do you think you've learned from your participatory experiences?
I think it dovetails in that no university will do it the same, because every university has different procedures and policies. And also there is completely no handbook for how to do it. You have to work with the people that you are working with in the way that works best for them. And I think that's the thing that probably scares people the most, is that you can't just be handed a guidebook on participatory research, it's a lot of learning from your experience and talking with people, making decisions with people, rather than what traditional research might be of, well, if I want to find out how to code this in R, I can ask people and they'll tell me. No one will tell you exactly how to work with someone to find a survey that works for someone who has specific needs. You have to work with someone who has those specific needs on what works best for them.
Yeah, I completely agree, Sarah. People sometimes ask me for advice and it always starts with, well, it depends. Well, we've tried a few things. What about you, Susanna? What key lesson do you think you've learned from your experiences so far?
Well, for me, I think it's more what I've learned that the industry has learned. When I was doing my research back in 2018 and was doing secondary research, I noticed that there are a lot of gaps in the data that existed. Very little on people with sort of high cognitive function. It was all children or older adults, pretty much nothing specifically on females, and it was all quantitative, which for me just seemed bizarre. Like, why are we looking at people as numbers and not as human beings? So 2 years and a bit on to now be part of this project that is so inclusive is just awesome, because I was not existent in any of that information that existed a few years ago. And not only am I now being given a voice, but I'm being given the chance to give other people a voice as well. And for me, that shift in the industry is just brilliant, and it's just so exciting to see. And I feel like, you know, there's just so much further to go, and I feel like we're actually headed there, which is really exciting.
That's wonderful. I love that. There's so much further to go, but we're actually headed there. I think that's a brilliant place to be in. Tapping into some of what Sarah was saying, you know, that every co-production needs to be kind of bespoke. You know, one of the ways in which perhaps the audience might be quite familiar with tailoring co-production and making it accessible to autistic people is about tailoring things like to communication preferences, sensory preferences, and so on. But I've also encountered some more sort of, for me at least, I found them challenging barriers and perhaps less recognized barriers to co-production. So things like autistic burnout, inertia, and also stuff like caring responsibilities for parents, for example. And so I would really be interested to hear what our panel think are some good ways that we can overcome those sorts of barriers to co-production. So I'm going to come to Sarah first, please.
I think starting with caring responsibilities, if it's a parent.
Do you want me to switch to Eloise and come back to you, Sarah?
Yeah, my headphones decided to die for a moment.
Okay, I'm going to go to Eloise and then we'll come back to you. Okay, Eloise, sorry, if you could pick up, that would be amazing.
Yeah, so Sarah, I'll leave you to talk about caring responsibilities, and I'll address what you mentioned about autistic burnout, Sue. So if people are listening in and they don't know what autistic burnout is, there's a brilliant article by Dora Raymaker and colleagues, which is a qualitative study. I can post it in the chat. It's called Having All of Your Internal Resources Exhausted Beyond Measure and Being Left with No Cleanup Crew, which kind of explains it in a very simple way. And I think what we learned in our co-production project is you have to be flexible and you have to be idiosyncratic and you have to allow for people to dip out and dip back in again and make more contribution at some point and make less contribution at another point. And that doesn't mean that the power differential is, because you can't always get everyone being involved to the same extent at the same time. And actually being flexible and allowing people that space makes them better contributors. So I think it's about being really flexible and really curious and asking them, what can make this better for you? Do you just need time out? Do you need something different? Do you want to write your responses? Do you want to have some more processing time? And just being really, really curious and compassionate about how each person responds to life and how they are responding to the project and how you can help.
Lovely. Sarah, can you hear us okay?
Yes, they just like to die on a random moment. It's very thrilling. I would say for caring responsibilities, there's kind of two sides to this. There are those who are carers for those who may have support needs, and it's kind of working around them and being flexible to their needs, because they may not be able to give as much time if they are looking after someone with higher support needs or personal care needs. And also remunerating, or just frankly paying them for their time. And also for parents, we've seen during kind of the pandemic that people have now been, in some cases, offering payment for expenses such as people's Wi-Fi or kind of resources that like that you wouldn't have in this kind of same instance if you were in person. And I think it's providing kind of that expense you're saving on renting a room, on giving them a support with childcare, because you're enabling them to be in the physical, not opposite physical, digital room that you're creating, and that may have been easier in a physical space. And I think that's not something that's given as much consideration, because there is the idea that everyone has the same ability to enter a space, and that is frankly untrue. And those inequalities are incredibly highlighted by co-produced products, where you're bringing those who are more marginalized in society together to work on a solution.
Yeah, amazing. And there's a really interesting point there you raise about the impact of the pandemic. Maybe we'll pick that up at a later stage. I just scrolled down. Pandemic, CoPro better or worse? ? Something we might pick up on. But I should stick to the script. So, but this is very relevant to that marginalisation point. So the next question I wanted to ask the panel is, what are some of the ways do you think we can involve non-speaking autistic people and autistic people with a learning disability in research co-production? So I'm going to come to Eloise first, please.
So I might answer a little bit about the pandemic in this answer, because we actually used a platform called Slack. I don't know if people know it, which you can type answers, and we had sort of hybrid meetings where you could either type or you could be on video or on Zoom, and really try to adapt for everyone's communication and interaction preferences. For example, if someone felt like they needed to be nonverbal, or they felt they couldn't help but be nonverbal at a point, then they were able to type their response and not miss out. And I think it was that access to knowledge, sort of what Sarah was talking about, that access to still having the room and the group and not missing out on the content or the discussion was really important. So I think making adaptations and being flexible, and sounding a bit like standing on a soapbox here, but being flexible and having those discussions and being curious and saying what would help you to feel included, how could you be on a level playing field here, because that phrase, nothing about us without us, like only that individual knows what they need, and it needs to be facilitated by the others.
Brilliant, thank you. Susanna, did you want to share some thoughts on this one?
Yes, I think I'm viewing this from a very different perspective, and arguably a controversial perspective, but obviously it comes from a very personal place, because it's almost like I just don't quite feel that research is there yet in a place that we can be asking this question. It's already hard enough for people that are able to speak and don't have learning disabilities to get into these roles, particularly if, like me, you have a coexisting condition like epilepsy, and I could talk all day about the issues with employment and epilepsy, but I won't. And I mean, this is something that Georgia and I have spoken quite a lot about, is that I don't even feel like at the moment we're necessarily collecting data from these people efficiently. A lot of it tends to come from secondhand reports, and we don't really have a way to prove that that's sort of authentic. So I'm just sort of thinking like, let's sort of work out how we communicate with them, get data from them first, get other autistic people that are, for lack of better words, more able into these positions. And then once the industry has developed, then we can start asking these other questions about, okay, so now that we know how to communicate with them and collect data from them, how do we help them help us collect the data?
And Georgia, I see, has got her hand up. What's your take on this, Georgia?
Yeah, this is certainly one where me and Susanna have had lots of conversations, and it's like, I think, quite a good example of participatory community research in action, because you have lots of different perspectives involved. So for me, I disagree with Susanna in that I see very strongly a social model of disability. And there have been people who have been involved directly in the project, including someone with a diagnosis of a learning disability, who has made some of the most substantial sort of contributions to the research itself in terms of how do we define direct and indirect experiences? How do we label those as data so that we can sort between when something is someone speaking about themselves very directly, or something is kind of inferring or assuming experiences of others. So I really think that it's not some sort of zero-sum situation where we're involving people who it may be more difficult to involve because of social barriers is at the expense of others who are maybe more able because of those social supports and barriers that are making the difference between the two groups. But I really, really feel for Susanna's situation, because I think there's a danger of tokenism, whereby people, I think what Susanna is really afraid of is people being not genuinely consulted, but kind of consulted tokenistically in a way that isn't really respecting their genuine experience. And I'm like, I think that her point that that's actually difficult to do and requires some vigilance to make sure that that is actually what's happening. It's not just some researcher who hasn't got learning disabilities or learning differences, as I would see it, inferring their experience, because that's an easy way of doing it. So I want to point out, like, we have different views, but I respect Susanna's views immensely on it.
Let's go back to Susanna, because I see Susanna's put her hand up.
Yeah, no, I just was that, you know, I fully respect that participatory science is all inclusive, and I do think everyone should have a chance to be involved. It's just I also see it as a process, and I just don't necessarily think that's as far as this has come, at least not from my personal experience. And that doesn't mean I think, you know, we're talking about how to get involved. That doesn't mean if you are an autistic person with learning difficulties or that doesn't speak, that you shouldn't try and get involved. I just don't necessarily think we should be out hunting for them, if you get what I mean. Not that they're creatures or anything, just, you know.
Yeah, I think I do know what you mean, Susanna, and you're right. You know, that there is this. I'm very fearful of that sort of tick box exercise. You know, look, I found a couple of autistic people with a learning disability, and theoretically they're helping me with my research, right? If we don't have the right communication tools, then, you know, we can't do that well. Georgia, did you want me to come back to you? Is your hand still up?
Yeah, just very quickly, because I don't want to like hog the time, but I do think that almost like where people with like I'm thinking of this one individual actually with the diagnosis of a learning disability, but where he was involved in empowered positions, which were more like leadership or research positions, where he could actually decide on the route of research, then his unique and specific contribution was most important, and I think is not something that someone without that particular who wasn't in that particular constellation in the Caroline Hirst model, if you see what I mean, could have done. So I think it's really vital that we empower people across the whole constellation. That's my view of it.
Yeah, and it's a slow process, isn't it? I mean, it's like a lot of things. There was a question about after Duncan Astl's keynote yesterday, someone was asking about the measures that they used in their study, and did they have any measures of classical kind of strengths? And they mentioned sense of justice, and I thought, oh, what I wouldn't give for a good, reliable measure of sense of justice. That would be an amazing tool to have in the toolbox as a researcher, right? But it's a whole research project just to develop that measure, let alone start to apply it and then learn anything from it, you know. So this is one of the reasons why our research can move quite slowly. And I think there's a parallel there with the methods that we need in place to do good participatory work with some communities. Right, let's come to our final scripted question, and then we'll open up to the floor. I can see people have been posting in the Q&A. Thank you so much. There are some really juicy questions in there, so that's going to be fun. But before we get to those, I wanted to ask the panel, what do you think are the most effective tools beyond fair payment, which I think we all agree is very important, for trying to reduce the power differentials that exist between researchers, including autistic researchers, of course, and community representatives from outside of research careers? So, Sarah, what do you think about this? You've been on both sides of the table.
I think it's one of the most effective tools is honesty about scope, because that is one thing that I think that's where a bit of the tension can arise from, because researchers have an intended scope in mind of how far something can go, but they may not communicate that with the communities that they're working with, which means you can get a lapse in shared decision making, because you may have people from the autistic community coming saying, we want these things to happen, but the researcher knowing that ultimately those things will never happen within this project, because that's not within the remit of the piece of work or as far as the work can go. And I think in that kind of radical honesty sense, it's also being very comfortable with open conversation and being honest with people, because if you're honest about there being a power differential, that having a salary is very different to being paid ad hoc, that being the ultimate decision maker is very different to being the person who is invited onto a project, who can be disinvited at any time. I think having those difficult conversations is the most important thing. And I think people are often too worried about annoying someone or causing disagreement, but disagreement can be a really healthy tool to getting to the final point, because there's no point working with a group of people if you've just created a group for consensus, because you might as well have not brought a group together. You might as well just have done it yourself. So honesty and disagreement, and kind of recognizing where there are institutional, systematic, and kind of otherwise barriers that you can't unpick. It's kind of being very aware that those things are still there and trying to work around them.
Yeah, brilliant. Thank you, Sarah. I completely agree, though it's easier said than done sometimes, isn't it? I feel so ashamed of my limitations. I have to say, this is all we can manage, this tiny little thing. Georgia, what are your thoughts on this one?
I think really along the lines of what Sarah was saying, being very mindful of the multiple layers of institutional bias that can be challenging. So again, this is something that Susanna actually has brought my attention to a lot, in terms of, you know, not being a member of an institution, not being able to access resources, needing support, and that therefore creates a huge responsibility if you're a researcher who does have access to those things, to share that access and to find ways like this one is a platform of influence and power. So sharing those on an equal level. And I think also for me, what's helped me a lot is thinking about the whole research cycle and trying to break it down. So from the very early scoping or priority setting phase, like this was way before I joined the project, but Autistica did some amazing priority setting involving loads of autistic people in asking the question, what should research be looking at? And so this project is based on what autistic people see as a priority for research, right the way through to analysis. Like there are some amazing examples of neurotypical or non-autistic bias when it comes to interpreting results as being distorted, or like losses when they're actually, autistic people are doing better at a task than non-autistic people. So all the way through from scoping, data gathering, research design, analysis, speaking, publication. So just trying to get through the whole research cycle, I guess, would be where I would look at it.
Yeah, that's a great way of thinking about it. Thank you, Georgia. Right, so we're going to come to some of our questions from the audience that have been posted in our Q&A. Just a reminder, if you have posted a question in the chat, please copy it into the Q&A box, because I can't keep track of both, is really the bottom line. We won't manage to answer every single question, but I will focus on the ones that seem most representative of the comments that are being brought up. So this is a very good one, right? Do you have any thoughts about how, who should I ask this to? I think Eloise would be a good person to ask this to first. Do you have any thoughts about how a closeted autistic researcher should navigate questions around co-production? It feels very strange to be in a position of either disclosing something personal or sensitive, or to lie and be seen as an interloper. I wonder what you think, Eloise. That's a good one.
It's a really important question, something I'm sure many people will relate to. And I think first and foremost, no one should ever feel that they have to put themselves in a vulnerable position by disclosing something that they don't feel comfortable with disclosing at that point. And I don't think it's necessarily lying not to disclose. I think it's if you're protecting you, then that's very, very justified. I have felt vulnerable at points, being an openly autistic researcher, and I think it's important to have support networks around you, and to set those up maybe before, and really have a really clear idea about where you can get support if things are tough, or if you feel that vulnerability is becoming too much. And as I think your points of like the whole point of co-production is that everyone's points are valuable, whether you're autistic or not autistic. And there does seem to be a sort of balance where people think that the autistic person's only points are only valuable, but I think everyone's points are valuable, and everyone's supporting them, carers, professionals, and that's what co-production participation is about, everyone having a voice. And obviously that it should be person-centered. The autistic person should be at the center of everything everyone's doing. But if you don't disclose, but you still want to have a voice, that should be listened to. And if it's not, then maybe the process needs some work. I don't know what anyone else thinks. I
think that's great, Eloise. Susanna, you pop your hand up.
Yeah, well, I think when we're talking about this idea of closeted autistic, I think it's very important to sort of bear in mind the diagnosis process and the fact that not everyone may have a diagnosis. And obviously without diagnosis, you don't get support. So I think it's kind of far more complex than just that, because you may have self-diagnosed yourself, but that doesn't mean that systems agree with you necessarily. So I think it's important to think about everyone sort of on this autistic spectrum, whether they're self-diagnosed or in the process of getting a diagnosis or already have one.
Yeah, absolutely. We don't know each other's neurotype, right? We don't always know our own. And so we have to hang on to that uncertainty, don't we? Okay, I'm going to move on because there's so many great questions. So Bethany is asking, how have you overcome, I'm going to ask Sarah this one. Sarah, prick up your ears. How how have you overcome barriers to utilising participatory approaches for context where other academics or higher professionals felt it wasn't reliable or valid science? And she's added a sigh at the end of her question.
I would say it's kind of continually advocating for it. A paper I found very useful for this is by the panelist that was meant to be here, but unfortunately cannot, Hannah Picard. It's about the experiences of early career researchers and established researchers in the barriers that co-production and involvement face. And that's really kind of crystallized how difficult it is to put these things into place, but also some of the barriers that exist. I mean, I've just said that sentence twice in 2 different ways. But I think it's definitely clawing your way to further and higher up buy-in, because without that higher buy-in, we know that it's much more difficult. And I think it's definitely finding those who are warm to the cause. So within universities, there'll typically be like public engagement units or things like that who will be able to kind of bolster you and support you if supervisors or established colleagues do not, and finding more and more kind of patches of warmth to the cause. And it feels like a rallying war cry really, but it's trying to find those who are most able to support you before you're able to tackle those who are least supportive.
Yeah, completely agree, Sarah. Thank you. That was great. Okay, so there's a question here. I'm going to ask Susanna. I think I'm going to ask you this one first. So they say that they want to take the discussion in a little of a new direction, and they want to ask, what do you think about the connection between ethical aspects of working with the autistic population, the link between that and efforts for full and equal integration of autistic people in society? So what's the connection, I think, between inclusion in research and inclusion in society more generally? Susanna, what do you think?
Well, I think the simple way is, obviously, the more we understand, the more we can teach and the more we can accept. So I guess in order to get inclusion in society, inclusion in research has to happen first. And obviously ethics is always a huge part of any kind of research project, but particularly when working with people that may be considered to be vulnerable. And I've been working on the moderation part of the AutSpaces site, so that's something that we've been looking at a lot. You know, what is appropriate, what isn't, how is the best way to deal with those situations fairly but informatively. There's an awful lot to it, but yeah, I think from my personal experience, you know, I wasn't diagnosed till I was 15. I never had the support through my education, and I blame a lot of the sort of bullying, the issues I faced, on that lack of diagnosis and consequently that lack of understanding. So for me, I guess that's sort of my answer is, well, once we've got people involved in research and got more and more info, then we can start spreading that info and people can start accepting better.
Absolutely. Does anyone else want to chip in before I go to the next one?
Yeah, I think that's a brilliant answer, Susanna. I think as well with this project that we're doing in particular, because it's looking at sensory processing differences with autistic people and how that changes how they might navigate environments in their daily lives, there's a very direct impact, because what we're looking at is what are the barriers people might face that then policymakers, architects, city planners can actually change those to make the world more accessible. So that depends on having a diverse, fine-grained set of qualitative experiences. So really you need participatory science in order to be able to gather that. So I think that there's a real direct relationship between the research and that kind of impact. But yeah, exactly what Susanna is saying as well, sort of educating non-autistic people about autistic people's experiences.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Georgia. And I'm going to send this next one to you, so prepare yourself. So this is about jargon, and I think we can define a specific bit of jargon, but I'd also be interested to hear, Georgia, your thoughts about jargon more generally as a barrier. So David says, as a late diagnosed autistic, I have a passion to learn about autism from a position of no previous knowledge, especially through research. To do this, I have found myself having to wade through a jungle of jargon, new words and phrases and acronyms. I think that I have got to grips with co-production, but you've used the phrase intersectional awareness on a number of occasions, which is new to me. What does this mean? So I wonder if you can answer David's question, but also talk a bit more generally about that jargon issue, Georgia.
Sure. So to answer that question about intersectional awareness, firstly, this is a phrase that has a very specific, it comes from somebody called Kimberly Crenshaw, who was looking at why is it that we have a way of understanding discrimination in the American justice system for Black men and for women, but when it comes to Black women, the fact that they might be treated differently by the justice system, but by the very fact that they're both Black and women, isn't really properly factored in by juries or the legal system. So she basically invented this concept of intersectionality, which is just a metaphor thinking about roads, to say, well, actually, if you have lots of different attributes or lots of different aspects, it's not the case that just understanding one of those things is enough. You have to understand the relationship between both of them. And I know that some people are quite sensitive of this being taken out of that original context. I think that when we think about intersectional awareness and autism, a lot of the time what people are saying is you might, for example, be autistic and dyslexic, so you might have trouble reading and writing and you're autistic, or you might have depression and autism, which means that the therapy you might get given by the NHS for depression maybe isn't suitable for you because you're autistic, to give an example. So really what we're just saying is you have lots of different things that combine in a way that means that you're an individual that needs a specific understanding to do with those combined aspects. So jargon, I really feel you on jargon. I am a horrible person for using jargon all of the time. My brain just thinks in jargon. And one of the brilliant things participatory science has taught me is I need autistic people to help me because otherwise I will produce these really unnecessarily complex, confusing paragraphs, which aren't good for autistic people or anyone, to be honest. So one of the most amazing researchers who's been working with me is someone called James, who is a strategist. He has all these wonderful skills and also has a brilliant mind for putting things into kind of icons and phrases and terms which are clearer, not just for autistic participants, but for me as well, honestly, a lot of the time. So I think the right people to help non-autistic researchers with engaging with autistic people is autistic people, and the right people to help researchers engaging with people who are not professional scientists but are still interested is citizen scientists or citizen researchers that you've included in the project. So that's just another reason to me, why would you involve people who are not professional scientists in the research process? It has this amazing effect of letting it spread further. And I'm very sorry if I've used loads of jargon during this panel. I'm sure I have now, thinking back, but brilliant question. Thank you so much for asking it.
That was a great answer, Georgia. Thank you very much. So there's a pair of questions here about the kind of future of participatory research and especially funding for it. So Sarah, I'm going to ask you what you think first, and then maybe I'll ask Eloise as well, if that's okay. So the first person says, for PhD students particularly, time and funding are barriers to conducting participatory research. Do you think there'll be changes in the future that will allow PhD students and other researchers to undertake more participatory research? And a second question on a similar topic, Are funders open to budgeting for the kind of support needed to include co-producers? Some of what's needed will look non-standard to traditional funding agencies and could lead to rejection. So, you know, what are our options for the future for making sure we have the resources we need to do participatory work? Sarah, what do you think first?
I think things are changing. I'm seeing kind of more PhD programs that are created with involvement in mind, which is shocking, and it shouldn't be shocking, but is really kind of welcome. And also a greater awareness among supervisors to filter down those funds to enable involvement to make these projects better. Kind of particularly at the beginning of this year, there were so many different little individual PhD projects that were looking for students that were co-produced themselves. And I think in Scotland somewhere, there is a PhD program which is specifically about teaching them about co-production, involvement and research engagement. And if that's replicated across the rest of the UK and further afield, that is amazing. I think in terms of resources, trying to remember what that question was. So many different questions on the thing.
Do we think that funding is going to be available to support this work, given that it might look a bit non-traditional to funders and that might lead to proposals getting rejected?
I really hope that that sort of guidance comes from the top down. So things like NIHR are currently, so the National Institute for Health Research are currently reviewing all of their information around involvement in research, from payment through to how do you actually just thank people for what they do. And as one of the largest funders of health research, I think they're best placed to say, actually, yes, we will fund this additional support for this person, because if you are involving someone who has higher support needs, then they may need a carer to be paid to support them doing that, but because it's not employment, they may not be able to access it. So there's barriers there. So I think it's something that should be taken into account. And I hope that with the wider discussion about how co-production and involvement have changed over COVID, and that this is the kind of next frontier, so to speak, of how we make involvement and co-production much more inclusive.
What do you think, Eloise? Do you have any thoughts to add from your perspective?
Yeah, I agree with Sarah that I think it should come from top down, ideally, and maybe idealistically, because really the funders need to be advocating for fair participation. And also I think they going back to the question about power dynamics we had earlier, I think within the structures of research funding, which are kind of mysterious and enigmatic to me, but I think they should really be looking at those power structures and trying to set frameworks for best practice, which include people being involved and people being fairly compensated for that involvement. I know that lots of NHS trusts and universities have sort of participatory groups, but I think there's a long way to go in terms of making that equitable. And the other thing I'd mention is that since I started my PhD, sort of, when was it, about 7 years ago, there was hardly any talk of participation or co-production. And now there's lots and lots of papers on the topic. People are reflecting on what's their own processes. People are making recommendations, and hopefully this will just grow and grow until the noise is so loud that people can't stop listening to this call for participation. And yeah.
Yeah, I think so. I think so. Okay, so Eloise, I'm going to come back to you again with this one. So the questioner is asking, how do you suggest autistic researchers negotiate participatory research, as the necessity to include other autistic people in all stages goes against many of our skills? I totally agree with the principles, but have found examples of it being used against actually autistic researchers. So any advice appreciated. What do you think, Eloise?
sorry, I'm just finding the question so I can remember and address it properly. It's tricky, isn't it? Because I guess, so I personally probably would not struggle with involving others in my research, although I can get very sort of blinkered and hyper-focused and do a lot of work without thinking of anything else. But I think, yeah, it's really tough, and maybe it shouldn't be the onus shouldn't be on just the autistic researcher to arrange the co-production or participation. Maybe it should be on the sort of structures around them, so the university or the research group or the department or NHS. Like, maybe it shouldn't maybe these structures need to be embedded more systemically rather than just being at the whim of an individual researcher who then has to deal with lots of administrative and sort of logistical questions. And I think we're starting to see that in some universities. And I don't know if anyone else has any thoughts on that one.
Anyone else want to chip in? I would love to, but I started reading the next question. And my brain couldn't handle both incoming streams of information, I'm afraid. I'm going to go on to the next one. There's a pair of questions here that I think are really great from Holly and Colin. So let me think. Maybe Susanna, I think, be interested to ask these to you first. So they're quite long questions, but I'll try and summarize it. So Holly says, how important is it that autistic participants are made aware of the researcher or funders or research centres' previous research? For example, previous relationships with or funding from or participation in projects which don't align with autistic research priorities? Is it something that autistic people should have the responsibility to research for themselves? Or is this something that could and should be provided by the research team so that autistic participants can make an informed decision about whether they want to contribute? So this is all about, you know, someone like me might be doing great participatory work now, but they might have a slightly more checkered history in terms of the work that they've done in the past. And is it their responsibility to declare that up front? And I think relatedly, Colin is asking about how research teams can support autistic collaborators from the community, because sometimes autistic members of projects can be the target of attacks on social media if people don't agree with the design of a project, the partners or funders, or the results. And this can be particularly hard when some of those things are valid, but not within the funding or scope of the project. So again, a similar theme about, you know, the extent to which we might be making autistic collaborators vulnerable if they're kind of hitching their wagon to something that, you know, doesn't look as good as it should look. So Susanna, sorry, that was a lot of information, but I'd love to hear your thoughts.
Yeah, no, definitely. I mean, it's definitely interesting, because I would like to say that I'd be word not coming to mouth, but I'd be, you know, open-minded enough that I could agree, okay, well, that was the past and opinions were different in the past and things have changed since then. But I feel like if something had been done that specifically or directly offended me, then yeah, I might not want to contribute to that. So I think it's definitely important that people are made aware if there is anything potentially controversial that they are attaching themselves to, especially if it is going to be public and online. And I know that, yeah, the autistic community is a very passionate community about everything, bad and good. And obviously it is so vast that nobody agrees on everything together. So I think it's definitely something to bear in mind, is sort of what kind of pressure you do put on your participants in that way, and how you support them through that. I don't know, it's to be honest, I don't tend to do an awful lot of research when I get involved in something. because I'm just generally quite lazy. But yeah, I suppose if I Googled a researcher's name and, you know, a scary headline popped up, I would definitely question it. But then again, you know, everyone has a right to speak their side and explain themselves. So I guess it's a complex thing that I could only really sort of answer if it was something that I'd experienced. I mean, I do get backlash online just because I'm very anti-ableist and sort of think, even if it doesn't offend me, if it may offend someone else, it should never be used, it should never be said, kind of thing. And a lot of people don't necessarily agree with that, particularly if they believe that certain terms are being used in correct ways. And obviously that's very complicated when every country in the world seems to have different standards. And epilepsy is a very good example of that, because I think my diagnosis has technically changed about 5 times in my life just because of what is considered to be appropriate and inappropriate and how that's changed over time.
I should thank you, Susanna, that was amazing. I should just mention we have gone over 4 o'clock. Me and the panel agreed beforehand that we could sort of stretch to 4:10, but if you do need to go, audience members, then that's fine. You know, we have reached the end of our official time, but there are just a couple of great questions here towards the bottom of the list that I would like to just pick up. And so there's one here from Daniel, which really follows on actually from what Susanna's just been saying. I'm going to ask Georgia initially, I think. What do you think can be done to generate more trust and transparency and build good relationships between autism researchers and participants? I assume, you know, autistic people.
I think this is a really brilliant question. And I think, again, I think that in the history of autism research, there has been a lot of reason for autistic people to be quite mistrustful of autism researchers. And I think that there's some kind of acknowledgement of how that's gone wrong is to do with perhaps this overconfidence in being able to say, this is some objective truth and this is how I'm going to interpret someone else's brain for them. Like, I think that dynamic is just entirely the wrong dynamic. So I think that requires a completely different framing of what research should be about and who it's for and who ultimately is able to determine the kind of the final analysis, if you like. For me as well, I think there's lots of issues around consent and transparency. So I really believe strongly that the onus is on researchers to be clear about what their research is as much as possible. And that's not always easy if it's a very complex project or involves a lot of kind of technical expertise, but I do think it's possible. And I think that certainly as well, things like having dynamic consent, where basically, that's another jargon term, but where if someone is being involved in a project, you make it clear, here's what data I'm taking from you or what information I'm taking, here's where I'm putting it and what I'm doing it, and here's why. And if I want to use it for a different purpose, I'm going to ask you again. So say, be very clear about what your intention is. Also be very open to other people leading on things who maybe are not the original core research team. So for me, there's like a whole combination of things that are required, but it is quite a complex issue. I don't think that there's one kind of easy solution to that.
Sarah and then Eloise, I see you've both got your hands up.
I think for me, it would just be researchers actually engaging with the community and kind of that being sustained engagement with the community, because particularly if you've suddenly been asked to be involved on a project, it feels really inauthentic if it's right before, like, they're trying to get it in for the deadline. If they've talked to you beforehand and they know you, that feels so much better, and like that kind of length and depth of relationship. And also people who are very kind of open to learning about like why things haven't worked well in the past and not being kind of confrontational when someone is explaining using their own lived experience as to why that has been harmful, I think it's a lot of researchers maybe kind of are protective of their careers, whereas like for autistic people, their research impacts our lives, and that hasn't always been a positive impact. And so there's a certain, I feel like the word reparations is a bit too strong, but kind of just making up for the bad deeds of research past.
Yeah, absolutely. Eloise?
Thanks. I think this question also speaks to sort of double empathy problem maybe, and which is the idea that although non-autistic people often say that they don't understand, that autistic people don't understand social norms and things, actually non-autistic people also don't understand autistic people, and breaking down those barriers is something I think needs to happen to encourage the research to feel more sort of honest and open, and doing things in ways that suit autistic people, asking explicitly what they need, being explicit about what they need as researchers, and also the authenticity thing that we talked about before. It doesn't just work one way. Non-autistic people sometimes put up barriers too, and actually helping them to be a bit more authentic, I think, can make everyone feel more comfortable.
Thanks, Eloise. So I'm tempted to try and shoehorn in one more question, but I actually think I'll leave it there because it was a really nice point to end on, that kind of broader issue of building trust between these kind of communities and traditions. So I'd just like to end by thanking.
I mean, can I just conclude on that?
Sorry, I didn't see your hand. Please.
Yeah, can I just conclude that? Yeah, no, I just want to say I totally agree. It's very much a matter of communication, and obviously that can be difficult when you're dealing with autistic people. So for me, it's a matter of making sure that they accept me for who I am, they make those adaptations, and I don't have to adapt for them. And just that sense that you do what you need to do and you don't have to do any more than that. And that sort of just general understanding that this is what I'm going to give you, that's what you're going to get, and vice versa.
Amazing. Yeah, that's that. What did you call it, Sarah? Not brutal honesty, something. Anyway, some kind of honesty. Sorry? Radical honesty. That's what we need. So I can radically honestly say that all of the panel have been magnificent, and I've really enjoyed this, just as I suspected I would. Wonderful to hear such voices of experience, and also such innovators in the field of participatory autism research. So thank you all for being here. Thank you all for listening. My deepest apologies to people who asked questions and didn't get them answered. I tried to get a good spread of different things, and I'm sure people would be happy to hear from you in the future. And this recording will go up online. Thank you very much to Autistica for inviting us, and off you go for a nice cup of tea.